Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome today's program Eric Meister, who is Chief Operating Officer at LeanLogistics. And today we're going to talk about what kind of shipper are you? The path to developing and building an effective transportation strategy. Now, this is kind of the second episode of a series that we're doing, really talking about the attributes of building a strong transportation foundation. And certainly one of the elements, one of the components of that is building an effective transportation strategy. And in many ways, it begins with that question, right? What kind of shipper are you? So Eric and I, we're going to dive into that question and kind of the other aspects of what it takes to build an effective transportation strategy in today's episode. Just a reminder that, part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you are joining us live today and you want to ask a question, you can do so via the Ask a Question button or via the chat feature. And I'll keep an eye on that. And if it's a good and appropriate question and we've got time, I'll certainly try to weave it into the conversation. So with that, Eric, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. It's always a pleasure to join
you. Eric, like I mentioned, in the first episode, we talked about the attributes of, building a strong transportation management foundation and how to build it. And, certainly an important, component of that foundation is defining and implementing an effective transportation strategy. So I guess the simple basic question is, what's the first step in that process?
Sure. And fundamentally, what kind of shipper you are is really based on a couple of elements. One is your strategies. So that includes your supply chain strategy, which includes a comprehensive set of strategies covering all the functional elements of supply chain, supply management, procurement, demand management, production, inventory, distribution, customer service, reverse logistics, the entire supply chain ecosystem. The second component of the strategy is transportation strategy. And really, in that component, you're looking at how do you position transportation to support the supply chain strategy? What are your modes of transportation? What are your equipment types? Consolidation programs, is transportation a profit center versus a cost center? Frequency and service levels, regional versus national, centralized versus decentralized, common carrier versus dedicated private fleet. And a third element, which is derivative of the transportation strategy, is the carrier strategy. How do you position your carrier partner network to support the transportation strategy? How do you select carrier partners? How do you interact with them? How frequently do you meet with them? How do you communicate your service objectives, your demand performance? How do you mitigate risk and drive continuous improvement? So those three elements of strategy all play a role in defining, what kind of shipper you are. The second component of that is how do you execute against those strategies? So, what does your data tell you about how you execute, how you perform, and are you really operating in a way that is consistent with your strategy? And those two elements are really foundational to determining what kind of shipper you are.
No, great point. I think one of the things that you said that kind of resonates with me is the fact that obviously transportation strategy doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's got to ultimately align with your business strategy and objectives, as well as your broader supply chain strategy and objectives. And then I think another thing you said is that obviously you can't, do this on your own, right? It really requires your external trading partners as well as your carriers, to be a part of that. And so I want to kind of explore those topics later on in the conversation here. But can you give us some examples? If I'm a shipper, how do I go about answering that question? What kind of shipper am I?
Sure. So a fundamental component of that is really understanding what the unique business requirements and characteristics are of your business. And so there are some fundamental questions regarding those characteristics which help formulate the strategy and allow you to develop a waterfall strategy from supply chain to carrier strategy. For example, one is what is the variability of your demand and supply? How predictable is your demand and supply? Another characteristic would be identifying what the unique value proposition is to your customers. Is it cost? Is it service? Is it innovation, flexibility, or a combination of those factors? Another area of interest regarding how you develop that strategy and how you determine what kind of shipper you are is how is your supply chain positioned relative to your customers and your suppliers? What is the relative scale of your operation and what's its sophistication compared to your trading partners? What are the unique characteristics of the products that you manufacture and distribute? And then what's the relative importance of transportation cost in overall total cost? So those are, and there are many more, but those are just some examples of some of those key supply chain characteristics which help you formulate that strategy. And an example of how that comes into play in waterfalling from supply chain strategy to transportation strategy to carrier strategy would be the classic example of a clothing and fashion or maybe an electronics manufacturer who has a high margin product, a lot of new products with a relatively short product life cycle, where transportation tends to be a relatively small component of the overall sales value. And those types of supply chains, there's a heavy focus on the availability of inventory, the ability to tap into additional capacity to respond to pull signals from customers, and then ensuring that deliveries are within the appropriate windows to make sure that the risk of lost sales is minimal. And so the strategies that flow from that impact transportation and the carrier strategy are, how do you access that additional capacity? How are you building potentially redundant capacities with different service levels to help mitigate any fluctuations in supply or demand? So a heavy emphasis on flexibility versus efficiency, which is key. And in comparison to maybe a food product or a consumer product where the demand is more stable and the focus is more on ensuring an efficient flow of goods from inbound to outbound finished, from inbound raw material to outbound finished product. So, and maybe there's less of a need for that flexibility and that risk mitigation in the strategies for those types of customers. So the one thing that we find is that shippers typically have one physical supply chain, but have many virtual supply chains that run across that physical supply chain. And so being able to segment your supply chains and being able to design the corresponding transportation and carrier strategies to support that segmentation is critical to effective execution. And another example there would be, perhaps the transportation strategy, the carrier strategy for new products or promotional products is very different from the base product, or inbound raw materials and the strategies around those. The movement of those items is typically different than the strategy around outbound finished product. So, fundamentally, your metrics, ultimately your metrics are key to understanding how you segment your supply chain, how you develop those strategies, and then how effective you are at executing them. And what we find is that the better aligned your strategies are from supply chain to transportation to carrier strategies, and the better aligned they are with the execution, the better able companies are and the more effective they are at managing both cost and service at the same time. And in companies that may have less alignment or not as aligned, typically there is a trade-off between cost and service as opposed to managing both those factors critically in the same way. So that foundation of data and metrics, being able to benchmark to allow you to identify your supply chain performance and segment your supply chains within your business is critical to determining what kind of shipper you are.
You kind of referenced it a little bit there, toward the end. You talked about, benchmarking, and data analysis really as part of that. Do you see many of the companies you work with or many companies kind of leveraging BI analytics, certainly network-based data to try to kind of get that understanding, at least create that baseline of where they are today?
Yeah, the best-in-class shippers are aggressively and regularly benchmarking their performance. But in order to benchmark, you have to have a foundational you have to have the foundational elements of metrics and data that allow you to do that. And so, there's a hierarchy there of ensuring that you have that baseline data that's timely and accurate, allow you to benchmark, and specifically around segmenting the supply chain and understanding the various supply chains that you're dealing with and understanding what kind of shipper you are. The critical set of data really revolves around cost to serve. And it usually involves the segmentation of your customer base and therefore your supply chain. And so being able to capture the relevant data in a timely manner that helps you develop that cost to serve information is critical. So, from a service perspective, it's things like on-time pickup and on-time delivery. And I'd also include, when you're talking about what kind of shipper you are, some of the broader measures around your demand variability and your forecast accuracy. From a process indicator and metric standpoint, it's things like order lead time, tender acceptance percentages, route guide compliance, adherence to capacity commitments. And then obviously cost is a critical component, having all the components of cost, line haul, fuel, non-fuel accessorials. And probably just as important as having those elements is being able to explode those elements down to the lane, customer, or product level so that you can have the appropriate insight to measure performance. And then once you've reached that level, that's the point at which you can go outside and really attempt to capture some benchmark information to understand how you're performing more broadly against companies that have similar supply chain strategies and design as yours.
No, a great point. I mean, I think it obviously there's an amount of prerequisite work and thinking that has to take place before you can run out and start doing some benchmarking, right? So it's kind of what is it that you're benchmarking yourself against, right? And what are those critical measures that make the most sense, relative to what you're trying to achieve. So I think that's a very good point. So let's talk a little bit about you addressed this already a little bit around alignment. So let's start at the kind of the higher level, right? In terms of your transportation strategy should align with your overall business strategy, right? So how do you connect the two?
Yeah, for me, it's fundamental going through all the strategies, the supply chain strategy, the transportation strategy, and the carrier strategy. It's fundamentally people, process, and technology that allow you to hook those together and ensure there's alignment over time. So, processes and technologies that are designed to provide transparency, visibility, and data are critical to ensuring that there's an alignment between the various levels of strategy. And critically, as things change in your business, as various levers are pulled, maybe for example, the inventory strategy changes, having the measures in place and having the visibility in place to understand what the impact of those changes are to both upstream and downstream in your execution is critical. And so we kind of talked about a waterfall from the supply chain strategy to the transportation strategy to the carrier strategy and the execution. But there's also a feedback loop forward that allows you to understand, are your strategies aligned and what impact changes have on your overall performance. So an example would be, what is your carrier performance telling you about your supply chain strategy? If you have a significant change in your on-time or cost performance with your carriers, what is that telling you about your supply chain strategy? And having that virtuous feedback loop to ensure that there's alignment. Fundamentally, if your metrics are in place, you've got a great way to ensure and measure alignment as you go through the process. And the supply chain ultimately is an investment, and being able to articulate the impact of changes in your supply chain, changes in your strategy, the return on that investment is critical for transportation professionals if they want to have a seat at the table.
Absolutely, and I like the point you made in terms of that feedback mechanism, because I think that is obviously a continuous process, right? It's not a one and done thing. Before we move into the next question, we got a question here from Joe that kind of relates back to what we were talking about previously with regards to benchmarking and leveraging data. So let me go ahead and put that up on the air and read it. It says, does Eric have an opinion on shippers gathering intelligence from load boards, DAT, internet truck stop, et cetera, as a way to get more transparency into rates, deficit market areas for trucks, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for shippers to better understand what's going on in the current marketplace. The question regarding that data becomes how relevant is that compared to your overall carrier strategy. So for example, if you're contracting with your carriers on an extended time period and there's a trade-off between a commitment on price and capacity, what is the relevancy of spot market data to that broader contract that you may have or your strategy you might have with carriers? But fundamentally understanding what's happening in the spot market and understanding what's happening in the short run in transportation is critical to building your overall understanding of the market and being able to articulate that back to decision makers in your organization. So that's something that whether it's accessing it through external means or through your technology provider. So in the case of LeanLogistics, we have a benchmarking tool that allows you to understand what's happening in the market. We have an index tool that allows you to understand what's happening in the market on both a strategic and a transactional level. That's critical for transportation professionals to be able to measure their performance and understand what's happening in the market.
Great question, Joe, and I agree. I mean, I think that certainly seeing a lot of interest from shippers in really accessing this type of information to stay as informed as possible on an ongoing basis in terms of what is happening in the marketplace. And I think to your point, Eric, I think is the ability to be able to put that data, that information in the right context relative to your strategy, relative to your business drivers, I think is part of the challenge or part of what's important to really leverage that data, that information as effectively as possible, correct?
Absolutely.
Great. Joe, thank you for the question. So again, bringing it, talking about the waterfall here, bringing it down now to, looking at your transportation strategy relative to your broader supply chain strategy, and then being able to make it executable, right, and execute it. I mean, how do you synchronize transportation with, let's say, warehousing and, your other components of your supply chain logistics, processes, and make sure that it's, at the end of the day, what you've defined as a strategy is something you could ultimately execute on? Yeah,
so I think from when you take it from, we talked a little bit about the alignment, how do you align across and synchronize across the various strategies, and if you take it to the next level of how do you ensure that your partners are aligned. So previously we talked about kind of synchronizing within the four walls of your organization. The next step is to then ensure that your external partners are synchronized around your strategy. And a fundamental component of that is being able to articulate what your strategies are to those partners. Have you communicated to your carrier partners or your supply partners what your strategy is so that they can align? And especially in this environment, it's a great idea to solicit feedback from your partners on what kind of customer or shipper you are. And especially with the market as it is today, carriers are not shy about telling you what kind of customer and what kind of partner you are. And in a lot of cases, they have very insightful data that they can provide you that gives you that insight. And a lot of them have customer scorecards that are very similar to the scorecards that they receive that tell you where you rank and what are the critical factors that are important for them to be successful with you. So I think that's one thing. If you haven't asked for that, if you haven't asked your carriers on how they score you and how they rank you, do so, because I think that can be extremely insightful and support that alignment, that longer term alignment across your partners. The trading partners, suppliers, and customers sometimes can be a little trickier for transportation professionals because the the ownership of those relationships may reside outside transportation, but there's this whole generation of supply chain professionals that understand that in order to be effective in their functional role, they need to be developing holistic solutions across the supply chain in a cross-functional way, and identifying those people that want to work with you to develop proactive solutions and communication is critical. So, ultimately, there is a role for technology to play in that trading partner alignment as well. So having a platform that promotes transparency and visibility and access to data across the transaction set is critical. And having that platform in place can provide a catalyst for an ongoing and deeper engagement, which allows for better alignment of strategy and execution.
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately, boils down to, the two C's that we always seem to talk about, right? Communication and collaboration. And communications is so, it almost sounds trivial to say it, but it truly is so critical and foundational to really create that alignment, to really, bring the trading partners in, the carriers in, to make sure that alignment exists. So unless you communicate frequently, honestly, and as transparent as possible, you're not going to get that trust developed that you're going to need to really work as one versus each one trying to do things in isolation or in silos. That is often the case. And to your point about asking carriers kind of what their perspective is of you as a shipper, just yesterday I wrote a post on Talking Logistics, what carriers look for in shippers, right? And somebody posted a comment that, that's the state of the market today, where we're now, we have, carriers are the ones that are in some ways, driving the discussion in terms of really be able to provide that feedback to shippers, and shippers being open to really looking for that information to understand how they can be a better partner, if you will, to make sure that at the end of the day that they get that capacity as things get tight. So let me it seems like Joe has asked another question here, so let me go ahead and ask his question before I get into my next one. And his question is: problem with organizational alignment is many non-supply chain executives still think supply chain is staffed by a bunch of, quote, box kickers and labor lickers. So education of non-supply chain managers is critical. Is it the responsibility of supply chain leaders to, quote unquote, dumb down what is going on in the external transportation network and be able, and I think we've lost the rest of it. So anyway, the bottom line there being, and be able to explain it to even a VP of finance. Okay. So, the short of it is, the amount of education that is required perhaps to communicate the value and the importance of supply chain to those that are outside of the field.
Yeah, ultimately, I think it is the responsibility of leaders in supply chain and everyone in supply chain to be able to understand and articulate how the role that they play ties in more broadly with the goals and objectives of the organization. And specifically, when you're working with finance and accounting individuals, being able to articulate how the good things that you do in supply chain have a direct bottom line impact to the company and to your organization is critical. Adrian, we've spoken before about the new supply chain agenda, and how that book kind of walks through as a functional person in the supply chain. How do you articulate your value to the organization, and how do you do it in a way that people who maybe don't understand the complexities of supply chain, the complexities of transportation, can understand? And that's critical to get support. It's critical to get resources and dollars and capital. And so that is the responsibility of supply chain professionals. And what can you do about that? One thing is, who are you partnering with? And are your partners supporting you in that endeavor? Are they providing you with the information and insight to make that case to others in your organization? And then, it's having a external focus. I mean, we kind of talked about this before, of making sure that you're gathering market information and intelligence to wrap and craft that message in your supply chain story to folks in the organization who are going to be making decisions about your success or failure.
Yeah, another great question, Joe. Thank you. And I think you did, raise a very important element and component of this in terms of, defining that strategy and getting that buy-in, and that is the, educating, those around you that need to play a role, quite frankly, and be able to offer that support, to that strategy. So thank you for your question. So Eric, you kind of might, we're kind of short on time here, so I've got a couple of questions here. When you talk about strategy, the word itself and then the process itself kind of implies, taking a long-term perspective, right? But when you look at the business and transportation environments today, they're so dynamic. So, how long-term is, transportation strategy these days? In other words, how often should shippers evaluate their transportation strategy, and what are some of the common triggers to kind of take a second look at it?
Sure. I think, typical strategic planning cycles, are 3 to 5 years. But the reality is, to your point, that changes are happening much quicker than that in businesses and in supply chain. So, as I would hope that with most organizations, there's a check against strategy at least once a year when you're doing the budgeting cycle. But then there are some other things that happen that are going to drive, a discussion around strategy, and those would obviously be things like acquisition and divestitures, significant organic growth or decline, the introduction of new products, changes in the market, so significant changes in the transportation market, or maybe supply markets that require supply chain changes. And one thing that I think is probably underestimated, and there's a going forward, this is going to be an ongoing issue, is changes in regulation. And ultimately, again, we talk about that feedback loop up from transportation and carrier strategy up to supply chain strategy. What is the regulatory environment telling you about how you need to design your supply chain? So, what that leads to, the discussion of when you evaluate the strategy is, as we kind of said, and all these questions we've touched on, the point is the people responsible for execution need to be connected to the external market and have a good understanding of what's going on in the economy, what's going on in transportation markets. You have to be externally focused to ensure that when the right point in time is to trigger a discussion around the evaluation of strategy. And fundamentally, if you have the right data and metrics and the right business processes in place, they'll tell you when you need to look at your strategy. So instead of it being a search for data, the data comes to you and tells you, hey, something has changed in our supply chain, something has changed in our competitive marketplace, something has changed in the regulatory environment. It's impacting our metrics and data, and we need to take some action and talk about a longer term approach to addressing these issues.
Great. So, as a way to kind of summarize, our discussion here, if you had to come up with a brief, checklist of the actions a shipper should take, to develop an effective transportation strategy, what would be on that list?
So I would say that although we've talked a lot about segmentation and understanding the supply chains in your business, that the process by which you develop your transportation strategy and execute it is very common across businesses. So, there are some fundamental elements that all folks need to have in order to ensure that their transportation and carrier strategy are effective. And the first thing is to understand how your unique supply chain characteristics drive your supply chain strategy. You have to have that fundamental understanding and be able to connect the dots between the supply chain strategy and your transportation and carrier strategy. You also need to be able to articulate that. You need to be able to not only understand it, but then communicate it to your trading partners, to your internal and external customers. You need to understand what your metrics and your benchmarks tell you about the effectiveness of your execution to those strategies, and at what point you need to make modifications. You need to develop the people, business processes, and technology to support metric-based continuous improvement on that execution. You need to make sure that there's a feedback loop to up the strategy ladder to ensure that things that are happening in transportation impact the supply chain strategy. And as a supply chain leader, you need to be able to effectively communicate your contribution to the supply chain return on investment. And if you tackle those items, you're going to be in the upper percentiles of performance, and your transportation strategy and execution will make you a shipper of choice.
All great points and a good framework or outline to think about, in moving forward here. So with that, Eric, we're out of time, and like I always say at the end of every episode, we always manage to just scratch the surface on these topics, but I think you provided some great, insights and ideas here in terms of what it takes to build an effective transportation strategy. So again, thank you for your time and joining us today.
Thanks, Adrian.
And I want to thank those of you that joined us live today. And Joe, thank you for your questions and comments. And if you are watching this episode on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Eric, you can find this episode on talkinglogistics.com and post a question or comment there. I'm sure that Eric will be more than happy to respond via that medium. So thank you very much for joining us again on the second episode of this educational series on the attributes of building a strong transportation management foundation, and look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you very much and have a great day.